Okay, welcome to our panel in which we're going to discuss the future of the novel. I think it's required. I'm Walter Hunt. I'm a science fiction writer and more lately a historical fiction writer, but this has time travel in it, so you know it's science fiction. As I was telling Alan a moment ago, how could you pass up any panel that has the word sex box in the description? So I'm just glad to be here.
Read that description.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Ready? All right. Lots of exciting stuff was supposed to happen by now. That didn't. No interplanetary travel, no rocket packs, not even any sex bots. You don't have any sex. What if this kind of thing goes on? What factors make it likely that the coming decades will be really dull? Frankly, do you really want to live in interesting times? So, let's have the panelists introduce themselves. Would you give us a start?
Yes, I'm Leonard Hitchie, and I write science fiction, and I have not found the future to be, those portions of it that I have lived through, I have not found the future to be bad.
I'm Alan Steele. I'm a science fiction writer. I'm just going to let that go.
My name is Chuck Cannon. I'm a science fiction writer. I write nonfiction about science fiction. I'm a professor and have a book that actually deals with this on the military side.
I'm Brett Cox. Most of my fiction is not science fiction, much more sort of horror, dark fantasy, what you will. But I've done work academically with science fiction. I'm an associate professor of English at Norwich University in Northfield, Vermont. I'm a lifelong reader and lover of science fiction. And when we get more into the discussion, I woke up this morning to a good dose of what I thought was the non-banal future and Good Morning America. And the two words I have for you are a chat roulette.
Well, of course, first we have to decide if we're going to take issue with the topic. I know Vernon's already said that he doesn't feel that the future that he has already experienced has been banal. I recently gave a talk at Needham Public Library about past science fiction writers and how they view the future and whether things turned out anything like or anywhere near as good or as bad as they depicted it. So I'm not sure I completely concur with the topic, but the main thing that I think, if you ask anybody, well, what do you think of where we are now as opposed to where we thought we were going to be? The first thing they say is, where's my Jetsons car?
Right.
And that's almost, that's almost a trope.
That's the banal of the banal.
That is, yeah, I think there's a certain amount of banality associated with the topic that doesn't necessarily reflect the banality of the present. I think we live in remarkable, if not interesting times. And I continue to have a sort of optimistic, hopefully not Panglossian view of the present and the future. I would rather be now than the now that I thought I was going to have when I was 10 or 12 years old. What does the panel think about the whole notion of banality?
Well, okay. This feels like what we were talking about. Well, anyway, it's like last night we did a topic that was sort of on these sort of lines, and so this feels like we're picking up where we left Charles and I and a couple of other guys were talking last night. So I'm going to sort of pick up a little bit of a reiterated trend of something I said last night, and that is one of the great misunderstood things about science fiction and it leads to a critical double standard, is the idea that science fiction is about predicting the future. And it is not. I mean, how many times do we got to say this over and over again? The purpose of science fiction is not to predict the future. Sometimes by accident it happens, but almost when it does happen by accident, it's always as a detail in a story. It's never the thrust of the story itself. I mean, the example that I use is Heinlein fans constantly point to that, the things that Heinlein predicted in his stories. Heinlein predicted the waterbed. Heinlein predicted the cell phone. Heinlein predicted. Actually, Charlie Strauss got sex bots, but anyway, yeah, and so forth and so on. But Stranger in a Strange Land is not a novel about waterbeds. Farmer in the Sky is not a novel about microwave ovens. Space Cadet is not a novel about cell phones. These are just little details that popped up that he managed to
But
get
on
right.
the other hand, John Brenner's Shockwave Rider is a novel about the internet.
But yeah, exactly, and sometimes, and sometimes it is getting it somewhat right, but even then, we knew that there were computers out there, and we knew that people would communicate, it wasn't that much of a, let me
You bring virus, computer virus.
Let me,
But all right, I'm sorry.
let me finish up on this. But the problem there is that, and this is something that SF writers and fans and everybody have been saying over and over again, the purpose of science fiction is not to predict the future. However, when a novel, particularly hits with near future SF, when it comes to pass that a future depicted in an SF novel does not come to pass. Like, for instance, Arthur Clarke's 2010 in no way resembles 2010 that we actually got. Then Strange says, well, this book was a failure. It didn't predict the future. We didn't have a manned expedition to Jupiter.
Again.
In 2010, so therefore, we should dismiss this novel and not read it anymore, and it's worthless. So again, it's a critical double standard that applies here. So when people talk in the subject here of the computer, but the future is banal as compared to what it was depicted in SF, it's like, did you really believe that this is going to happen? I mean, did you really believe? Does anybody really believe that in 2019 we're going to have killer androids coming back from the stars, and that we're going to have and guys to this terribly torn up Los Angeles where you're going to have Harrison Ford going to be hunting them? No, I do not think so. I don't think so.
Well, okay, so I think that's a point well taken. Still, science fiction's job is not to necessarily predict the future, but it's to think about it. And in that sense, I think we do find ourselves disappointed by the idea that we didn't get some of the things that we really wanted. How many of us wanted to be able to take a vacation on the moon or see the Earth from orbit? You know, any takers?
I'm still not giving up on that.
Well, one thing.
Beginning to give up on it.
One thing, and I've been thinking about this prior to the panel, one thing that strikes me is that there is such an increasingly wide sort of public consciousness of this very issue. I mean, there have been 2 books published recently with the word jetpack in the title. One of them is by a guy named Daniel Wilson called Where's My Jetpack? A Guide to the Amazing Science Fiction Future That Never Arrived. And the other is by a guy called Mac Montandon, if I can read my own handwriting, called Jetpack Dreams and the Search for the Greatest Invention That Never Was. And there, have been other books about this idea that we did have some expectations in the future. I don't want to, if there's a sort of disappointment to it, it's because that we did go in a direction that was not focused on, I don't think, in a lot of the science fiction we grew up reading, and this is by no means an original observation, but we wound up, we being, North America, the U.S., putting almost everything into communications and almost nothing into transportation. And so I can send an electronic mail to a space station, but I can't get from New York to Chicago any quicker than I did 40 years ago. And when I posted that at LiveJournal, somebody said, well, that's very clever if you could get there as quickly as you did 40 years ago. I always have to go through Atlanta. And so, and so what our vision of it was 2001. It was the Jetsons and all this stuff that involved us being able to get places very quickly. What we have instead is what I saw on Good Morning America this morning, where people get on Skype and sign into a network where they essentially do sort of speed dating video calls, and everybody logged onto it can just sit in front of their webcams and chat with each other without identifying themselves to each other for a limited amount of time, and then move on to the next person.
Some of them are sex bots.
And some of them are, and we do have some, and I do want to know, we do have sex bots. I mean, there was in the news a couple of months ago that at some adult toys convention or something in Las Vegas, as somebody had claiming to have made one of the things that we call robots these days that was specifically as a kind of electronic blow-up doll.
That was
So
on
the
the
sex
news last
bots-
week.
So the sex bots did that.
You had a question or a quick observation?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I don't think that our expectations of the future really come from science fiction so much as from like the 1950s House of the Future. And, that wasn't science fiction. That was actually, people trying to predict what the future was. They weren't fiction authors.
Sure, it actually antedates that considerably, but in particular, I mean, who inspired Walt Disney with the 1939, 1940 World's Fair?
Right, exactly.
The community of the future, the house of the future, the car of the future.
That's
been
a
a long,
long-standing American tradition,
Yeah.
sort of technotopia that goes back to Looking Backward by Bellamy.
And it
Before
is,
that.
got that right up.
and incidentally, there is still a sort of a future, if you go down to Epcot Center.
Yeah.
They have a walkthrough, which is of a living room and a kitchen of the alleged future with all these cool toys. And these things are functional and they demonstrate these things, but you're also aware that these are prototypes. And, I sincerely doubt that any of us will soon have a bathroom mirror that will tell us what our temperature is, or, whether or not we're sick, or.
Your cell phone will.
Yeah, the cell phone.
Isn't that-
Downloadable app, that's
I'm expecting someday to have the cell phone get up, sprout legs and walk off.
disgusted.
I was wondering,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to add in a few things.
Go to it.
Okay. I think, first of all, that when the future becomes the present, the exciting becomes the mundane. And there's almost no escape from that. And one of the things you see in the Epcot Center and Looking Backward and when Hawthorne writes stuff, and it's a very long tradition, is that it's always, of course, there's a lot of set dressing. It's not just a microwave. This is the microwave, and it is described, and bells, whistles, and everything. The future, actually, whatever the future happens to be, is it's that thing I use for that purpose. It has already acquired the patina, if you will, of the mundane upon it. I think also this topic for me arguably says more about the interests of people, a very, very diverse group that read science fiction, more than it says about science fiction itself. And I don't mean to say these are opposed opposites, but I'm going to talk about polarities, if you will, in books, in reading taste, whatever the case may be. On one hand, we have, I think, what probably an awful lot of writers, certainly the ones up here, knowing the folks or knowing their work, or both, we're very interested in exploring. Not predicting the future, but certainly exploring the future. Possibilities, marketplace of ideas, some place to go shop and say, maybe, maybe not, can it happen, don't know, but would I buy that? At the same time, constrained on the other end, going back to last night's talk, by the dystopic view of what do I absolutely want to avoid. Now, so there you've got exploration. On the other hand, you have escapism. And most of these objects that we're talking about, most of the banality, most of the failures, have to do, if you will, it seems to me, with somebody from the outside or inside looking in and saying, for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to forget the exploration component of that. We're going to focus on the product and the disappointments that arise out of the escapist urge. So, that's, I guess, the way I would sort of put my particular frame on this, because I don't think that the future is uninteresting or banal. But if all you're doing is saying the future I'm going to measure against the expectations of my escapist urge, of course you're going to be disappointed. You're going to be disappointed no matter what you get.
We've commented that I agree certainly that this nature of the feeling when something actually happens of diminishment compared to the expectation, just as you're saying. I remember the first time I came across that was reading in Tolkien's nonfiction book of essays, Tree and Leaf, where he makes the comment that if you watch an airplane flying up into the sky and say doing some mild acrobatics, it looks like a heavenly and celestial uplifting experience. But he says, if you actually do it, I don't know whether you actually ever did do it, it's very dull. And I was actually kind of offended by that. I mean, that I have flown, not done upside down acrobatics, but I have been in aircraft that flew around and did interesting things. And there is a certain diminishment compared to, you know, imagining it ahead of time, but I still got a terrific kick out of it. And nowadays, when I see something actually, you know, like this object, this laptop in front of me, it really does kind of thrill me. Now, I
Cool to be alive
easily
right now.
amused, pardon?
I think
Cool
so.
to be
I
alive.
think
Yes.
so, sure, absolutely.
No, it is, there is a certain diminishment because our brains are so good at, you know, jazzing us up ahead of time, but it's still very, very cool.
Well, do you think that if we look at, as I said, I did this talk which made me think about this very subject, and, you know, there are two kinds of futures that we didn't get. In addition to the technology we didn't get, or places we didn't go, what we have is we have a utopian future, which if you look at Bellamy, if you look at 100 years ago when they thought they were going to get the socialist future, no money, no poverty, no war, no disease, no kidding. And then there's the dystopian future, which is the post-apocalyptic, the comet hits the Earth, another planet hits the Earth, the Earth burns up, the nuclear war, biological war, Mikhail Rosner's Vanishing Point, or Stewart's book, any of these terrible dystopian
Level
futures.
9.
Cormac
And
McCarthy, The Road.
I don't think I'd trade 2010 with all its problems for any of those.
Oh, absolutely. I
But,
mean,
but I don't see myself trading my 2010 for any of the utopian futures, which do sound somewhat banal.
yeah, I mean, you know, Ray Bradbury famously said that science fiction writers don't try to predict the future, they try to prevent it. And I think that the fact that we did not wind up in a cloud of radioactive dust when Alan and I were 4 years old is quite a step in the right direction.
This is what we were talking, again, it feels like, I'm trying to, this to be an inside joke between Charles and I. But last night, one of the things that we mentioned is the fact that one of SF's major achievements may have been the fact that probably the genre was probably, at least in part, responsible for preventing the thermonuclear holocaust. Because, I mean, the ashes of Hiroshima hadn't even cooled before SF writers began showing what the results of global thermonuclear war would be. And this was at a time, you know, it's now been forgotten, but in the years after Hiroshima, the military was really sort of looking at the atom bomb as being, well, this is just a bigger bomb. I mean,
Right.
we can deploy this at will.
It's like manageable evil. It's like,
Yeah, and it wasn't, and so I mean, beginning with stories like Theodore Sturgeon's Thunder and Roses, and going through Alas Babylon, and clear up through The Day After, which was the one that really got people.
Or not, though it's not a very good depiction on the beach, which was
Yeah.
very, very popular.
How
on the
many
beach.
people have read The Murder of the USA?
No,
I know.
Murray Leinster, 1948, and it is probably the most comprehensively engineering-oriented book that I've ever seen. He essentially has subterranean retaliation bases, and they use synthetic aperture antennas to he has all sorts of stuff like that in 1948. And we've suffered an attack with a fractional orbital bombardment system, and we don't know who did it. It killed most of the people in the country. And whoever is doing it is picking off these deep targets that could retaliate. And so the point of the book is they have about 6 weeks before all our remaining deep sites are destroyed to figure out who it is that is nuked the USA. And that story has just been completely, it's a novel, it's
Yeah.
been completely forgotten.
Well, and during the Star Wars or SDI issue, it was interesting how people forgot that Chris Neville, his name is wrote
Yes.
a story called Cold War, which was
Yes.
about orbital weapons and can you maintain the system and really just how much of a shield is it and how much of it is bluff. And the bottom line is, yeah, those of our ilk have been at have been at the forefront.
Right, I also have to mention just something like Dr. Strangelove.
No,
Just
yeah.
that film, and every third episode of The Twilight Zone.
Yeah,
Sure, yes.
Well, let me third.
Bridges Meredith and the glasses is the one I remember.
Yeah, that's the thing about it. I mean, this was shown over and over and over again. And sometimes with comic horror aspects, like Dr. Strangelove.
Boy and his dog.
Which is a very interesting, read, if you ever get it, it's a hard book to find, but if you can find Peter George's original
Oh, yes.
novel,
Yes.
Red Alert.
Yes.
Which was done as a straight novel. And then Kubrick bought this, but saw the comic potential and flipped it upside down and did Strangelove. And then Peter George rewrote his original novel.
Well, he wrote he had another book called Commander One that was much darker than Dr. Strangelove.
No, but there's a second edition. There's two different, there's one called Red Alert, which originally appeared as an ace book.
Right.
You know, it's got a couple of B-52s
Yes.
on the cover. And that's the straight treatment. And then when the Kubrick movie came out, he rewrote. He did this treatment. He basically rewrote his own novel, or basically he novelized Kubrick's treatment and did a novelization.
Precious
And that was
Follies.
Dr. Strangelove. So you have to distinguish between the two of them. When you say, I've read Dr. Strangelove, you gotta ask.
What did you call the second?
It's called Dr. Strangelove.
Okay.
It's simple, it's called Dr.
This could easily turn into a panel on the weirdness of this business.
Yeah. But this was,
I don't think there's time, there isn't
Oh,
enough
God,
time in
there-
the margin to know
absolutely.
all of this. Terry, you had in your hand up, that suggests you have something to say.
Well, my thing is that all that's from the U.S. point of view, leaving out the other half of the equation of the nuclear war, which is Russia. They didn't have any of that.
Russia had a very interesting thing. You know, several years ago, the history of Russian SF, particularly during the Soviet period, is actually kind of interesting. Several years ago, Analog did like an all Russia issue, and they presented, this is after the Cold War was over, and they translated and republished several works of science fiction that had been published in Russian SF magazine. And in the introduction, it was pointed out that Russian SF writers approached it from an entirely different viewpoint than SF did. And there were two different schools. One was a very utopian view. This is the future, and this is how we're going to get there. And, you know,
5-year plan at the time.
yeah, I mean, it was very much state approved, you know, and it's banal as hell, you know, very pedantic kind of features, you know. We're going to Venus. We're going to, because Venus is the red star, and we're going to have the red star on Venus. We can now chime in the International. But there was also in the SF magazines, which were almost samizdat, was a kind of a science fiction that, on one hand, was very skiffy. It was about interstellar travel, and the stories themselves would not be out of place, you know, in amazing or fantasy and science fiction or whatever,
From 2 or 3 decades earlier.
or even at that time. But you could take a look.
Perry wrote that in S.
Yeah, sort of, except that when you read into it, it didn't take a lot of decoding to realize
A lot of
that
subversive.
there was a lot of subversive elements in there.
Did the Senate committee simply not read the?
They were attributed to the Americans.
Well,
They
there
would-
was-
They would talk about the Russians and they just say Americans, Americans.
If you take a look at that, there's a lot of plausible deniability built into the stories, the characters, the words. You can see it in the satellite nations of Warsaw Pact. I mean, Stanislaw Lem, there's that
Right.
chapter about solaristics, which is really a disguised rip at Lysenko genetics. That's what's really going on there. And, you know, there is, what's interesting, going back to the East, I did one Fulbright in the Czech Republic, I did another in Slovakia about 4 or 5 years ago, and I was stunned to hear sort of what Terry was talking about. I don't know if it's exactly where Terry was going with it, but their lack of, they really didn't have, certainly in Russia, did not have the sort of consciousness. It was on the level of some stuff, because the state basically was still trying to sell what, of course, the US was trying to sell with duck and cover, only better. However, you go to the Czech Republic, and there were 2 or 3 versions of a story called Prakatit made, which dates back to, it's the turn of the century, and it's about this immense explosion. It's called that because of Krakatoa, blah, 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 blah. But it's when you go out into the periphery states of the Warsaw Pact, whose attitudes really were, okay, if you want to get yourself killed over Moscow, that's your business. But we know who's going to catch this right in the teeth. But again, very carefully done. Can't name any names. Everything has to be projected into a sort of an interzone, sort of nebulous land where there's a lot of
Or in the case, like one of the stories that was in Analog, I'm very briefly summed it up, had to do with a discovery of this alien race that has sealed itself off within an asteroid. And they are living entirely within this asteroid, and they have never seen the outside. And now, it begins to sound very familiar, like a Star Trek episode that we've all seen over and over again. But then they emerge from the asteroid and begin to see that the universe operates in a different way than they had imagined. And there are different societies that are out there. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not hard to see that this is talking about being in a sealed society, an enclosed society, where you're learning one sort of information.
China or like North Korea.
Or like Russia, or and then the doors open up in some sort of way, and you find out that everything you know is wrong. And this is the type of thing. Again, plausible deniability is the term here. If anybody challenged them on this, if somebody from the Central Committee said that you're not espousing proper revolutionary thought here, comrade, then they could say, oh no, see, this is just a science fiction story. I'm not criticizing the system, no. And this is a way of getting around it.
Does that support or contradict our ostensible notion that we didn't get the future we were supposed to get? Did these guys, brought up the outside of America, was there a sense in other cultures that the future was going in a different direction, that we were going to get things that we never quite got? Or is this more a straw man? Does this matter? To the topic at hand as well.
I'd like to throw out that this is not as an idea. Not saying that this is a cultural specific, but that different cultures may have different centers of gravity on the issue. I think for our culture, we're very, very, as I think George Steiner said, in no culture has so, made an object of worship of the imminent as American culture has. And to some degree, when if you take a look at the fact that, okay, just really, really quick thumbnail, full of generalizations, please forgive me. If the start is, okay, we're here and it's going to work out because God is behind us, and then, as the Nietzschean emphasis comes in and we say, well, maybe we really can't count on God to make it all happen. It has been a little while since Plymouth Rock. What's the answer? Well, the answer tends to be sort of, if you will, technotopian. It's God from the machine, in a sense, or that's at least part of the drift. We have a real deep investment, it seems to me, in that. I don't think the Russians do to the same degree. I think they're coming at it from a different direction.
The Russians or the Soviets?
Well, the Russians in general. The Russians in general, I wouldn't say have
Is
that.
this the dark sitting around and drinking?
No.
And inventing the,
No.
Okay, this is just.
No, it's that I think that when you come out of the entire Boyar era, and you take a look at, my gosh, 50 years ago or 20 years ago, I didn't have running water and I had one light bulb.
Well, did
And
Peter
we're the first ones to get to work.
Did Peter the Great create the future for Russia?
Not single-handedly,
But I mean, what I'm saying is by opening the door to the West, is that Peter the Great, science fiction in Russia? Do you understand why?
I absolutely do, and I think that's a very sensitive topic that I would feel a lot more comfortable talking about if I was a Russian, because then I could make generalizations, and I wouldn't be accused of being prejudiced, just a traitor. But I think that the Russians do approach it differently. I think science fiction has always had, taking a look at their stuff, it's always had a very, very political, philosophical element.
I don't know, I haven't read any recent, Russian SF. I've read a little bit of communist era. I don't know what is even published over there.
Soviet was a communist era guy there. I was saying Soviet team, the guy who wrote,
Yeah, oh, yeah, right, yeah, but there's also an interplanetary novel that, no, that's another guy. I've got it on my shelf there.
you get a question or comment pertinent to the current discussion? Or-
Yeah, there's a collection I have called The Ultimate Threshold, which is Soviet era science fiction.
The Ultimate Threshold.
Yes.
Okay.
Just,
Don't know, do you know that question? You would?
it seemed pretty obscure when I found it.
Okay. I should also ask, I should throw this out, but when we're talking about other cultures, I'm sorry, go, please.
But one of the things you said earlier seemed to strike me a great deal as related to this, is that science fiction is about not getting the future, you see. It has a great deal of warning of what can happen if we go down the wrong path, a great deal of focus on the failure of the human mind, which, you know, the single direction of the communists being ruled by one person's directing mind, very few directing
Or
minds.
the casual approach to, nuclear weapons, but just a bigger bomb, it sounds.
Yeah.
What about Oriental cultures? Japan is a
I don't know, I think we're sort of getting way
We are,
off
okay.
subject. We
All right,
really
well,
are.
let's go back to the idea. I think we were all kind of dismissive of the idea that the future turned out to be banal. I want to mention a book that I was talking about this before we started, and I mentioned in this talk I gave. There's a book that if you haven't read it, you should read it, and if you've read it before, you should read it again this year, because it's set in 2010. It's a book that was written in the late 60s. The name of the book is Stand in Zanzibar. It's John Brunner's book about the future.
And it got a Hugo.
And I
Yes,
believe
it
that,
does, yes, it
and
does.
when it was published, if I'm not mistaken, it was the longest science fiction novel.
Yeah, it was.
published.
And on
Over 200,000 words. Now, Brunner, the Brunner canon is huge. The set of Brunner books that are part of the essential Brunner, I think, arguably includes that book and The Sheep Look Up,
And Jagged Orbit.
and Jagged Orbit, and a shorter one called.
Those three were kind of a set, really. I
Yes,
mean,
yes. The Sheep Look Up is about pollution, really, and Stand in Zanzibar is about population. Now, an interesting aspect of this is, of course, a lot of the book is about the crowding of the planet, and it was published right about the same time as the population bomb. And you look at what he's talking about, that societies, particularly more industrialized societies, have to impose draconian rules on reproduction and on population. And the reason for that is that the Earth is so crowded. And if you look, and I just read this book again because I gave this talk, he predicts the population will be this outrageously large amount, which is 7.5 billion people, which is less than 1 billion people more than we actually have in this 2010. And we don't have draconian laws about reproduction. We don't prevent people with color blindness from giving.
Yes.
But the universe, the world turned out in that respect and in many others, very different than he expected.
Well, here's the thing about it, and this is with not just John Brunner's novel, but Arthur Clarke's novel and his wildly disparate view of what 2010 was going to be like, and just about any SF novel really that puts a date that's within reach. And this is, I hope I don't garble this, but I'm going to try to.
I was heading for something else about this, but that's okay, go ahead.
Just give me a second.
Sure.
Walter, okay?
That's all right, sir.
You got to remember is that in science fiction, dates are sometimes very arbitrary. You're coming up with a story. When I'm writing a story, and I imagine it's probably the same thing with Werner and with you and with Brett and everybody else, is that you come up with a story and it's going to be, it's going to be set in the future. And you think, okay, what's the date that I'm going to put this in? You don't spend a whole lot of time, trying to figure out exactly what date it's going to be and checking your calendar. And
The rule used to be easy, you just add 10 or 100 to whatever the current date was.
Right.
You could always date a story, but you just subtract 100.
It's almost an arbitrary thing. I mean, in science fiction, a date is not so much a time as it is a place. In other words,
Okay.
2010, that Brunner, or I won't talk about Brunner. If I start writing a story today, and I said, okay, I'm gonna put this in 2050, okay, 40 years from now, because 40 years seems to be about a plausible window for whatever it is to take place. That 2050 is not a date that I think that this is going to happen. This 2050 is a world that happens to be called 2050. I'm not making a prediction. I'm not even making a forecast. I'm just basically saying, okay, this is a place, and it's going to be called 2050.
1984.
Or not, right, 1984.
Well, he's written 48.
Which is 48 transposed. He wasn't making a prediction of what he thought 1980, Orwell was not making a solid prediction of what he thought was going to happen in 1984.
Well,
He was just flipping around two numbers.
Though
and then-
he did think in terms of a generation and a half. I mean, he deliberately made it relatively close to his own time.
Yeah, but still, but the thing is that, I mean, people still read 1984 and still allude to it, and it's still a plausible future, even if the date is long since past us. Brunner's world and Stand on Zanzibar, yes, we don't have that today. It does not mean that this still couldn't happen.
Well, what?
Arthur Clarke, when 2001 rolled around, and it was obvious that we weren't going to have, we did not have a moon base, and we didn't have a mission Mars, and computers maybe could talk like Hal, but they were nowhere near as smart as Hal. They were, and all these reporters and so forth started calling Arthur and saying, you know, what happened? Why didn't your prediction take place? Why didn't you foresee the future? And Arthur came up with that, I thought was a really good standard answer, which he said this over and over again. If I'd known how things would have turned out, I would have titled the novel 21,000. In other words, he and Stanley Kubrick picked a plausible date, and they called it 2001.
But while I like I think your point is very well taken. It's an illustrative concept to think of the dating of a science fiction future as place rather than time. I really like that. You want to steal that?
Go right ahead.
I think that if you look at what Brunner was writing about, he was looking at where he thought the society was in 1968, and he counted out a generation and a half or two generations. He said, if the trends that I see proceed,
If this goes on,
with the Cold War, the overpopulation aspects, the conflicts between societies, the permissiveness. I mean, he didn't see. There are things he didn't see. He didn't see sexually transmitted diseases the sort we have now. He didn't see PDAs, but he saw the internet. He saw the drug culture. He saw all kinds of things. But I think he picked that time because he felt that there was not unreasonable expectation that some of the things that were depicted would be close enough. And the people who are old GT in the story, is us 40 years ago. Our people our age plus 40 years, because she's 90. So she comes from she's our age, 50 or so, in the culture that Brunner wrote the book in. He thought, what if I take somebody that age and move them 40 years? What will their world be like?
Well, I'm
2010 for a reason, and I think you're right, but I think to some extent
It's in a window. You still pick it within a window that you're going to be in. But again, it's not like the idea that you're making a prediction or a forecast for what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm just really glad you brought up, because I have it in mind to reread that book this year.
This
for
is the year to do
exactly
it, yeah.
those reasons. But, my memory of the book, I mean, the population stuff didn't come about, perhaps in part because Brunner didn't anticipate, the radical innovations in agriculture that were going to make it possible to sustain on some minimal level.
We talked about the Mekong Desert.
Yes, and maybe he also didn't anticipate that we would, for whatever unfathomable reason, tolerate a world in which so many people are hungry all of the time. But what I remember, that it's not the population stuff, but this, him talking about this insanely immersive, radically democratized media landscape punctuated by occasional acts of terrorism. That's my memory of that, and that, isn't too far off. I mean, I think that book is, proof of one of my pet catchphrases is that we are not living in John Campbell's future, we're living in Michael Moorcock's future.
What I think is really interesting, I think what's kind of interesting here is that also, it seems to me that prediction has once again semi-hijacked the center of gravity of the panel. Because it doesn't seem to me we're talking really about banal anymore, because these topics, as far as I'm concerned, are anything but banal.
Do we think
One
we
of the
live in a banal
failures of,
future? I don't
one of
think
the
so.
failures of prediction, I think, also comes in
Right.
with the issue of, you can find any novel and you can say, you got this and this and this, but he didn't get PDAs and that. And by the way, I agree with you, absolutely. But the interesting thing is, can you even, let's make one assumption and then build out from it. Let's assume that one of us was enough of some sort of polymathic, gifted savant to get 90% of the changes. And then, second step, I write a book about it. You know what happens to most of the readers? What the hell's going on?
Yeah.
Nothing is similar. Okay, there are human emotions, and I get that. And the relationships have changed. Oh, except for this guy is transgendered every other day of the week. Well, I guess I'm going to have to put on hold the idea that I really do get all the relationships as well. In a sense, I think that any science fiction book can only take a slice. And the wider the slice becomes, fundamentally, the difficult it is to make it an intelligible slice.
That's why I said the hell with it and said my book's in the 24th century.
Yeah.
I know it.
Trying to write a truly alien life.
Yeah,
Aliens are
absolutely.
very hard, yes.
Absolutely.
We got a few comments from the
Yeah,
audience.
we've had people who have had their hand up for a while. Somebody had their hand up right now. Will, why don't you
Isn't it important that the correct predictions become banal by the time they happen? Because anything we use all the time, we're taking for granted. That's the advantage of stuff.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that one. I mean, I find it interesting that, okay, we didn't get the moon base, and we didn't get the weekly, space, passenger flights to all destinations on Pan Am,
Zero G toilets.
Hell, the Pan Am building doesn't even exist anymore, right?
Yeah,
MetLife now has it. But on the other hand, we've got an international space station that's as big as a friggin' football stadium that's in orbit right now, and hardly anybody ever thinks about it. I mean, we just had one of the last shuttle flights just went up there, putting up there an observation window of the thing, and you can read all about it on page 25 of the paper.
That's right.
Nobody pays attention to it.
Well, I think our interest in the space program, some of it crashed when Skylab fell in the ocean. Some
Well,
more
there's a
crash.
lot, yeah.
Yeah, but for us, teenagers, or college age people in 1973, the Skylab fell in the ocean. I think a lot of our dreams of what the future was going to be like fell in there with them. I certainly feel it. You've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, two things. First of all, the conflation of the mundane and the banal. A lot of people read mainstream fiction and don't find it boring. And the reason they read it and don't find it boring is because they find in the mundane that which is sublime and interesting. And God in the center of a flower, that sort of thing. So the notion that things came about and are now mundane and therefore are dull is a little,
Yeah, I think that's
unimaginative, because it seems to me that that which is mundane is not banal. The other part of it, though, what I won't say, use the word banal, but the word disappointing, is that I think science fiction, and while we're at fantasy, embody hopes of what we want, not escapism, but hopes of what we would like things to become. People spoke of utopian futures not coming to pass. People spoke of certain interplanetary exploration not coming to pass. Many things that we wanted to come to pass have come to pass, and that's fun.
And things that weren't predicted have come to pass that we do like.
Right, and many things that we wished would happen for human reasons have not happened, and we're disappointed. So we have the part of John Brunner's future that was predicted, and the awful thing is that it's horrible. The awful thing is that we're tolerating a couple of billion hungry people all the time and not minding. You know, that's,
Yep, yep.
Oh, me, okay.
Yes, you,
Mr.
Everywhere.
I remember what I was gonna say. Well, sort of get back a little bit to the point about like, in a very real sense, yeah, you write a book that really predicts everything, and then it kind of gets there, and to some extent, you're like, okay, so what? Yeah, you had cell phones. Thumbs up, great, so what? I had a professor of history in a historiography seminar one time, and he sort of turned the lens the other way. He was saying, like, you know, if you wrote sort of a defining book about exactly why the Titanic sank, for example, you know, and you could say, like, here's what happened, here's why it happened, and here's what one would need to do about it. He said, in a very real sense, like, you can sort of read the book and go, oh, okay, great. And then maybe you make changes to, like, make sure that this terrible disaster doesn't happen again. And then you're done with the book. Like, what's the point of reading it again? You know, like it's kind of, you've exhausted the topic, there's really nothing more to say, move along. You know, it's precisely because there's something more to it, that you might have something larger to say about disasters in general.
Academia says that no topic is ever completely exhausted.
Well, sure. I mean, which I argue with him about, but his point was in a very real sense that that particular book, like by trying to make a passionate case about like, this is what went wrong and what we need to do to fix it, he said, okay, well, once we take your advice and fix it, why do we need your book anymore?
No,
so like,
but I can't imagine very many subjects for which that's true. That
Perhaps.
that you run out. I mean, I have a historical novel I'm working on, some of which takes place right before the 7 Years' War, which is the French and Indian War in
Sure.
America.
the First World War.
And oh yes, absolutely. And I've been, one of the things I did last week is I sorted out my basement bookshelves, because I kind of wound up with things all over the place, and I have a bunch of historical. And I was amazed at the number of books I've actually accumulated about the 7 Years' War. You think everything had been said about it?
Oh, sure.
No, not a chance.
No.
And things haven't been said that will be said. I'm not sure there are any subjects, and similarly, from our genre point of view, I'm not sure there are that many subjects that have been fully explored, that there are new angles, that there are new things. And as we move as the future becomes the present, I think we have new outlooks. We have a different standard.
And I guess my point was just like, to the extent that like, oh, I've perfectly predicted what life would be like, everyday life in 2010. In 1965 I did this, and then 2010 rolls around and go, oh great, good job.
Well,
And I'm living it, so I think
if
I'll
you're
move
doing
on
it-
now.
Nobody's
If
done
you're
that.
doing it as
Yeah,
an
but I know, but if somebody
engineering,
did, it'd be kind of like, all right, whatever.
if you're doing it as an engineering exercise, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the issue is, why are you doing it? And, you know, this gentleman up here, I think, made a very good distinction at the front. I'm not sure, it makes me think that perhaps I wasn't heard the way I was hoping to be heard. But I think, you know, his point about you can find deathless verities in the mundane. You know, truth at the center of the flower. The question is, have you purged that out of a work of science fiction? If you have, its shelf life you can measure, you know, on a sundial almost. It's when it seems to me you take it, you say, what sort of people in what sort of world? And what does that world do to the people? Then you're talking about a kind of exploration that goes beyond merely the technical. But I would say, and that's one of the things that, to go along with what this gentleman said, that's what allows science fiction at its best moments to rise far above the banal.
Well, that's one point that I think it was Heinlein who made that point, that, you know, it's no big deal to predict the automobile. It's a bigger deal to predict the drive-in movie. It is a bigger deal still to predict the changes in dating habits that the drive-in movie will lead to.
Absolutely. At our electronic age, and what it's done to literacy, reading patience, the ability to digest and sort of think critically. I mean, you know, the two of us, we see the side that we
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, so we'll take a quick comment.
As far as his predicting the future that accurately, that would be the first proof of time travel.
Yeah.
They say, wait a minute, you did everything in 65 and it's true today. Had to have been time travel.
it would be, it's kind of an interesting thought.
And as far as stand on Zanzibar, I think the people in China might think it had a ride.
Oh, yeah.
You know, one of my favorite little thought experiments, and these things that you never intend to really do a story with, but it's something that you kick around, you know, late at night as you're about to go to bed, or you're in a bar drinking, whatever. But it's, well, one of my favorite little type of things is if we did have time travelers, if you did have people from the future who had come back and they're walking around among us. And what's that?
I don't know, I'm gonna step back.
You're gonna tell them about what goes on in the green room, Alan? You're breaking the law, the unwritten law.
But you know, and supposing that you couldn't go back, that you was, time travel was strange to you. And one thing, you want to keep a low profile, because the most dangerous thing in the
Keep a
world.
low profile, for God's sake.
Well, you don't want to let me know that you're from the future, because it could very well be that you're, you know, you get caught up. But how would you make a living? And I would think that one way would be become a science fiction writer, because you would certainly talk about the things that you knew where you came from, and just tweak them just a little bit so nobody can really nail you on it.
Yeah, and then you could buy stock in Microsoft early on, and then
Well,
you
that's
just write
true.
what you want.
That too, but that'd be a way of letting everybody know that.
That's true.
Excuse me, I'm due back at the mothership.
Yeah, right. Now, this is, you know, as I say, this is late night thoughts, you know, or whatever.
We depended if you knew in advance you were going to be stranded. Knew in advance.
If it was, well, that was, you
Bring
know,
some stuff with
your time ship crashes
You
or
could break a
whatever.
long record of the stock market for the next 5 years.
Yeah, that was done in Back to the Future, one of the later movies, yes.
Horse racing.
Sports Alley.
Yeah, right.
Well, of course, this brings up a point which sort of deserves its own panel, which is, there are all kinds of arguments about the rate of technological change. And I'm not convinced that this is slowing down in some respects, because 100 years ago, people who came forward would have a much harder time, or a much easier time of understanding the world that we live in than people from 200 years ago coming forward 100 years. People in 1800 coming to 1900 would be faced with all kinds of industrial revolution things that baffled them. And things like automobiles and radio. And people in 1900 coming forward to 2000 would see different things that baffled them, but would see different forms of things that they knew about. So it's unclear whether we're speeding up or slowing down in something.
Well, I think we're definitely slowing down. I mean, with the exception of some technological toys and gigas that are out there, I mean, 2010 does not look a hell of a lot different from the 70s when I was growing up. It really
Can't slow
doesn't.
down, I gotta say. And the second
Oh,
one,
no, completely.
I think you see a huge difference walking across.
Oh, yeah, that's what I mean, technology, yeah, is different, but society, not that much.
I think you should ask the working women in the audience.
That was speculated on in the 70s, and people
My wife worked here, she'd be all.
And also, before we break up, I have to toss in one of my favorite lines from that noted futurologist, William Gibson, which I say with affectionate irony. I think, you know, not exactly a systematic thinker about the future. That, where he said, you know, the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think that gets truer every day.
I think we gotta
Okay,
go.
we gotta go. Thanks for coming to our. Come here, we are.
I gotta run. I gotta do right now. Okay. Yeah, actually.